What happens when the system you've served your whole life turns its back on you? Fannie Moore, a 71-year-old black woman, stood trembling in a courtroom, her heart pounding like a drum. Accused of drug possession, she faced a charge that threatened to strip away her dignity and freedom. The police claimed they found drugs in her bag, but Fannie knew the truth. She'd been framed. Her weathered hands clutched the railing, her eyes scanning the room for a glimmer of hope. She'd spent decades training police dogs serving her community, yet here she was labeled a criminal. The whispers in the courtroom stung racial slurs cloaked in legal jargon. Isolated, overlooked, and betrayed Fannie felt the weight of injustice pressing down. But deep inside, a spark of defiance flickered. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who'd been wronged by a system meant to protect them. Little did anyone know her old dog Buttons, sitting quietly by her side, held the key to unraveling the lies. A reversal was coming, and it would shake the courtroom to its core. The small town of Willow Creek, Georgia, hummed with the quiet rhythm of late summer. Main Street was lined with mom and pop shops, their faded awnings fluttering in the breeze. The courthouse, a squat brick building with ivy creeping up its walls, stood at the heart of it all, its clock tower ticking like a metronome. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where history and secrets lingered in the corners. It was August 2025, and the town was abuzz with whispers about Fannie Moore's trial. For the folks of Willow Creek, Fannie was a familiar face, a woman who'd lived quietly on the edge of town, her modest clapboard house surrounded by a garden of roses and marigolds, but now she was the center of a storm. Fannie Moore at 71 carried herself with the grace of someone who'd seen the world change and change again. Her skin, a rich ebony, was etched with lines that told stories of laughter and loss. Her hair, once jet black, was now a crown of silver pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple navy dress, its hem brushing her knees, and a pair of sensible shoes that had carried her through decades of hard work. Her eyes, though, were what caught you, sharp, soulful, and unyielding, even as fear flickered behind them. Fannie had spent 30 years training police dogs for the county sheriff's department, her steady hands guiding German shepherds and bloodhounds to sniff out danger. She'd retired a decade ago, her pension barely enough to keep the lights on, but her love for dogs never faded. That's where Buttons came in. Buttons, a scruffy mutt with a patchwork coat of brown and black, was no ordinary dog. At 9 years old, he was getting on in years, his muzzle graying and his gait a little slower, but his eyes sparkled with intelligence, and his nose, oh, that nose could still pick up a scent from a mile away. Fannie had adopted him from a shelter 5 years back, sensing a kindred spirit in the dog nobody else wanted. What she didn't know then was that Buttons had once been a police dog trained to detect drugs and explosives before an injury sidelined him. The two had become inseparable, with Buttons trailing Fannie through her garden or curling up at her feet while she read her Bible in the evenings. He was her shadow, her confidant, and as it would turn out, her savior. The trouble started 3 months earlier on a muggy June morning. Fannie had been walking home from the corner store, her canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, Buttons trotting at her side. She'd bought a loaf of bread, a tin of coffee, and a few apples. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as she crossed the street, a police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. 2 officers, both white, stepped out. Officer Carl Grayson, a wiry man with a permanent smirk, and Officer Tom Heller, broad-shouldered and stone-faced. Grayson had a reputation in Willow Creek for throwing his weight around, especially with the town's black residents. Heller, newer to the force, followed his lead like a loyal dog. They claimed they'd received a tip about suspicious activity and demanded to search Fannie's bag. Fannie's heart sank, but she complied, knowing better than to argue. She stood on the sidewalk, her hands clasped as Grayson rifled through her tote. Buttons growled softly, his hackles rising, but Fannie hushed him. Then, with a theatrical flourish, Grayson pulled out a small plastic bag filled with white powder. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. Fannie's knees buckled. "That's not mine," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, but the officers weren't listening. They cuffed her, read her rights, and hauled her to the station, leaving Buttons to be picked up by a neighbor. The powder, they later claimed, tested positive for cocaine. Word spread like wildfire. Willow Creek was a small town, and gossip was its lifeblood. By evening, folks were whispering that Fannie Moore, the quiet dog trainer, was a drug addict, a dealer, a blight on their community. The local paper ran a headline, "Retired Trainer Caught with Narcotics." Neighbors who'd once waved hello now avoided her gaze. At church, where Fannie had sung in the choir for 40 years, the pews around her emptied out. The isolation was crushing, but Fannie held her head high. She knew she was innocent, and she clung to that truth like a lifeline. The courtroom on the day of her trial was packed. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, townsfolk reporters, and a few of Fannie's old friends from the sheriff's department. The judge, Harold Whitaker, was a stern man in his 60s, his white hair combed back and his robes crisp. He'd presided over Willow Creek's court for decades, known for his no-nonsense rulings. The prosecutor, Ellen Marsh, a sharp-eyed woman with a knack for theatrics, painted Fannie as a fallen hero, someone who'd betrayed her community's trust. This woman, once a respected trainer, has stooped to peddling poison, she declared, her voice ringing through the room. Fannie's lawyer, Marcus Tate, was a young public defender, earnest but overworked. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Fannie had no criminal history, but his words lacked fire. Fannie sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded, Buttons lying at her feet. The dog had been allowed in as a comfort animal, a small mercy from the judge. Every now and then, Fannie reached down to stroke his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of judgment, but she refused to break. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across Willow Creek. Inside, the tension was palpable, a storm brewing in the stale air of the courtroom. Fannie didn't know it yet, but the truth was closer than she thought, hidden in the sharp senses of the old dog at her side. The stage was set, and the conflict was about to escalate. The courtroom in Willow Creek felt like a pressure cooker, the air heavy with anticipation and judgment. Fannie Moore sat at the defendant's table, her navy dress neatly pressed but her heart racing like a runaway train. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished wood of the benches. Buttons, her scruffy mutt, lay at her feet, his ears twitching as if he sensed the storm brewing. The spectators leaned forward, their whispers a low hum, while Judge Harold Whitaker peered over his glasses, his gavel resting like a silent threat. Fannie's lawyer, Marcus Tate, shuffled papers nervously, his inexperience showing in the sweat beading on his brow. Across the room, Prosecutor Ellen Marsh stood tall, her voice sharp as she laid out the case against Fannie. "The evidence is clear," Marsh declared, holding up a plastic bag containing the white powder allegedly found in Fannie's tote. "This woman, once a trusted member of our community, has been caught red-handed with cocaine. She's not the hero you thought she was." The words landed like punches, and Fannie felt the sting of betrayal. She'd trained dogs to protect this town, yet here she was, painted as a villain. The gallery murmured, some nodding in agreement, others casting pitying glances. Fannie kept her eyes forward, her jaw tight, refusing to let them see her crumble. Officer Carl Grayson took the stand next, his smirk barely concealed. He recounted the day of the arrest with a practiced ease, describing how he and Officer Tom Heller had acted on a reliable tip about suspicious activity. "When we searched Ms. Moore's bag, the drugs were right there, plain as day," he said, his voice smooth but laced with contempt. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Fannie's. She didn't even try to deny it. The lie was so blatant it made Fannie's stomach churn, but she held her tongue. Buttons let out a low growl, his body tensing, and Fannie placed a calming hand on his head. She could feel the weight of Grayson's gaze, heavy with malice. Marcus Tate's cross-examination was weak, his questions stumbling over Grayson's confident deflections. "Isn't it possible the bag was planted?" Tate asked, his voice faltering. Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "Planted in broad daylight, you're grasping at straws, son." The gallery snickered and Tate's face reddened. Fannie's hope flickered, but she clung to it, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. She knew the truth, even if no one else believed her. The drugs weren't hers, and she'd never seen that bag before Grayson pulled it from her tote. But proving it felt like climbing a mountain with no rope. The prosecution called Officer Tom Heller next, and his testimony echoed Grayson's, though his eyes darted nervously. He was younger, less seasoned, and his words lacked the same venom. Still, he backed his partner's story, claiming he'd seen the drugs in Fannie's bag himself. Marcus tried to press him, asking about the tip's source, but Heller stonewalled, saying it was confidential. The judge nodded, accepting the vague response, and Fannie's heart sank deeper. The system she'd served for decades was closing ranks around her, and she felt like a stranger in her own town. As the day wore on, the prosecution's case grew stronger. Marsh presented lab results confirming the powder was cocaine and a chain of custody report that seemed airtight. She called a forensic expert, who testified about the bag's fingerprints. Fannie's were on it, though. Marcus argued they could have come from her handling her own tote. The expert shrugged, saying it was possible but unlikely. The gallery's whispers grew louder, and Fannie caught snippets of their words. Disgrace, shame, knew she was trouble. The racial undertones were subtle but unmistakable, a reminder of the biases that simmered beneath Willow Creek's surface. Fannie's isolation deepened with every passing hour. Her old friends from the sheriff's department, who'd once praised her skill with dogs, sat silently in the back, their eyes averted. The church ladies who'd shared potlucks with her now clutched their purses as if she might steal from them. Even Marcus seemed to be losing faith, his questions growing softer, his shoulders slumping. Fannie wanted to scream to tell them all she was innocent, but she knew it wouldn't matter. The deck was stacked, and the truth felt like a distant dream. Then came the moment that pushed the conflict to its breaking point. During a recess, as Fannie stood in the hallway with Marcus, officers Grayson and Heller approached. Grayson's smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. He leaned in close, his voice low so only Fannie could hear. "You're a smelly black woman who's addicted to drugs," he hissed. "You shouldn't live in America. Go back to your stinky country." The words hit like a slap, raw and hateful. Heller stood behind him, silent but complicit, his face unreadable. Fannie's breath caught her hands trembling, but she refused to look away. She stared into Grayson's eyes, her defiance burning through the pain. Buttons, tethered to her side, bared his teeth, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution rested its case, and Marsh delivered a closing statement that sealed Fannie's fate. "This is about protecting our community," she said, her voice soaring. "Fannie Moore has betrayed our trust, and justice demands accountability." The gallery nodded, and Judge Whitaker prepared to move to sentencing. Fannie felt the walls closing and her future slipping away. She glanced down at Buttons, his steady gaze meeting hers, and something stirred inside her, a flicker of hope, faint but stubborn. She didn't know how, but she sensed the tide was about to turn. The conflict had reached its peak. The lies and hatred laid bare. Fannie stood on the edge of ruin, but Buttons, her loyal companion, was about to change everything. The courtroom, oblivious to the truth, waited for the judge's final word, unaware that a scruffy old dog was about to upend their world. The Willow Creek Courthouse was a pressure cooker, its air thick with the weight of judgment. Fannie Moore, 71, stood at the defendant's table, her navy dress clinging to her sweat-dampened skin. Her silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but her sharp, soulful eyes were fixed on Judge Harold Whitaker, who was moments away from pronouncing her sentence. The gallery buzzed with anticipation, their whispers like static in Fannie's ears. Her lawyer, Marcus Tate, sat beside her, his hands fidgeting with a pen, his earlier confidence all but gone. Prosecutor Ellen Marsh stood smugly, arms crossed, certain of victory. The evidence cocaine allegedly found in Fannie's tote had painted her as a criminal, a betrayal of her decades training police dogs. But Fannie knew the truth. Officers Carl Grayson and Tom Heller had framed her, their racism laid bare in Grayson's venomous words during the recess. Buttons. Fannie's scruffy mutt lay at her feet, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. His brown and black coat was patchy, but his eyes sparkled with an alertness that belied his 9 years. Allowed in court as a comfort animal, he'd been quiet all day, save for the occasional growl at Grayson's testimony. Fannie reached down her fingers, brushing his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. She felt the noose of injustice tightening, but something in Button's gaze, a flicker of knowing, kept her from breaking. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but the old dog was about to turn the tide. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, his gavel poised. "Ms. Moore," he began, his voice grave, "the evidence against you is compelling. This court has no choice but to his words." Were cut off by a sudden sharp bark from Buttons. The sound echoed through the room, startling the gallery into silence. Heads turned and Fannie froze her hand still on Buttons' head. The dog was on his feet now, his body rigid, his nose twitching as he stared across the room. His gaze locked onto Officer Carl Grayson, who stood near the prosecution's table, his smirk faltering. "Control your animal, Ms. Moore," Judge Whitaker snapped, but Buttons barked again, louder this time, his hackles rising. He tugged at his leash, his body straining toward Grayson. Fannie's heart pounded. She'd seen that stance before, back when she trained police dogs. It was the alert of a dog who'd caught a scent. "Buttons easy," she whispered, but her voice trembled with realization. She hadn't known Buttons was a former police dog trained to sniff out drugs, but his behavior was unmistakable. Her mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't seen before. Marcus Tate, sensing an opportunity, stood. "Your Honor, may I request a moment? The dog's behavior is unusual and may be relevant." The judge frowned, but the gallery's curiosity was palpable, and he nodded. "Proceed, but make it quick." Fannie's eyes widened as she leaned down, loosening Buttons' leash just enough. The dog didn't hesitate. He bolted across the courtroom, his claws clicking on the hardwood floor, and stopped at Grayson's feet, barking furiously. Grayson stepped back, his face paling. "Get this mutt away from me," he shouted, but Buttons was relentless, pawing at Grayson's pant leg, his nose pressed to the fabric. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Prosecutor Marsh objected, calling it a stunt, but Judge Whitaker raised a hand, his eyes narrowing. "Ms. Moore, can you explain this?" he asked. Fannie stood, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Your Honor, I trained police dogs for 30 years. That's the alert of a dog who's detected drugs. Buttons isn't just my pet. He must have been trained before I adopted him. She paused, her gaze shifting to Grayson. He's telling us something's wrong. The judge's skepticism was clear, but the gallery's excitement was infectious. This is highly irregular, he said, but I'll allow a brief investigation. Bailiff escort Officer Grayson to a private room for a search. Grayson's face twisted in fury. This is absurd. You're believing a dog over me. But Heller, standing nearby, looked uneasy, his eyes darting to his partner. The bailiff, a burly man named Jim, stepped forward, and Grayson had no choice but to follow his protests, echoing down the hall. Fannie's heart thundered as she watched them go. She knelt beside Buttons, stroking his fur, whispering, "Good boy." Marcus, reinvigorated, leaned in. "Fannie, did you know he could do this?" She shook her head. "Not until now. I got him from a shelter, never knew he was one of mine." The revelation hit her like a wave. Buttons wasn't just a stray, he was a piece of her past, a partner in justice she'd unknowingly reclaimed. Minutes ticked by the courtroom, thick with tension. The gallery whispered theories, some siding with Fannie, others calling it a desperate ploy. Marsh paced, her confidence shaken, while Judge Whitaker tapped his gavel impatiently. Then the bailiff returned, his face grim, holding a small plastic bag identical to the one found in Fannie's tote. Behind him, Grayson was in handcuffs, his smirk replaced by a scowl. "Found this in his pocket," Jim said, holding up the bag. "White powder smells like trouble." The gallery exploded, voices overlapping in shock and outrage. Judge Whitaker banged his gavel, demanding order. "Silence, Officer Grayson, explain yourself," Grayson stammered, his voice shrill. "It's not mine. She set me up." But his words rang hollow, and Heller, still in the courtroom, shifted uncomfortably, his silence damning. Fannie's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of vindication. Buttons had done what no one else could. He'd sniffed out the truth. The judge ordered a recess to review the new evidence, and Fannie sat, her hands trembling with relief. Marcus grinned, clapping her shoulder. "We've got a chance now, Fannie." She nodded, her gaze on Buttons, who wagged his tail, oblivious to the chaos he'd unleashed. The turning point had arrived, and the courtroom, once a place of condemnation, was now a stage for justice. The truth was out, but the fight wasn't over. Grayson's lies had unraveled, but the system that enabled him still loomed large. The Willow Creek Courthouse was a cauldron of chaos, its polished wood and stiff benches vibrating with the energy of a crowd on edge. Fannie Moore, 71, stood at the defendant's table, her navy dress wrinkled from a long day, her silver hair glinting under the harsh lights. Her sharp eyes, once clouded with fear, now burned with determination. Buttons, her scruffy 9-year-old mutt, sat at her feet, his tail thumping softly, his nose still twitching from the scent that had changed everything. The gallery was a sea of wide eyes and open mouths, their earlier whispers replaced by a restless hum. Judge Harold Whitaker gripped his gavel, his stern face struggling to maintain order. Prosecutor Ellen Marsh, her confidence shaken, stood rigid while Fannie's lawyer Marcus Tate leaned forward, sensing victory within reach. Moments earlier, Buttons had upended the trial by barking at Officer Carl Grayson, alerting the court to drugs hidden in the policeman's pocket. The bailiff had found a bag of white powder identical to the one pinned on Fannie, and Grayson was now in handcuffs, his lies exposed. But the battle wasn't won yet. The courtroom teetered on the brink, and Fannie knew the system could still protect its own. She clutched the table's edge, her heart pounding as Judge Whitaker called for silence. "Order," the judge bellowed, his gavel cracking like thunder. The gallery quieted, but the tension was electric. "We have a serious allegation before us," Whitaker said, his eyes scanning the room. "Officer Grayson, you stand accused of possessing narcotics in this courtroom. This court will get to the bottom of it." He turned to the bailiff. "Bring Officer Heller to the stand. I want answers." "Officer Tom Heller." Grayson's partner shuffled forward, his broad shoulders hunched. His stone-faced demeanor from earlier was gone, replaced by a nervous tick in his jaw. Marcus Tate, seizing the moment, stood to question him. "Officer Heller," Marcus began, his voice steady, "you were with Officer Grayson during Ms. Moore's arrest. Did you see him plant the drugs in her bag?" The gallery leaned in, holding its breath. Heller's eyes darted to Grayson, who glared from the sidelines, then back to Marcus. "I didn't see anything," he stammered. "It was all by the book." Buttons, still at Fannie's feet, let out a sharp bark, his body tensing again. The sound cut through Heller's words, and Fannie's heart skipped. She knew that bark Buttons was picking up another scent. She whispered to Marcus, "He's alerting again. Check Heller." Marcus hesitated, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the dog is reacting to Officer Heller. I request a search." Marsh objected, her voice shrill. "This is a circus. You can't trust a dog over sworn officers," but the gallery's murmurs grew louder, and Judge Whitaker, intrigued, raised a hand. "I'll allow it. Bailiff, search Officer Heller." The bailiff Jim approached Heller, who backed away, his face paling. "This is ridiculous," Heller protested, but Jim was thorough patting him down. Seconds later, he pulled another small bag of white powder from Heller's jacket pocket. The gallery gasped, a collective shockwave rippling through the room. Judge Whittaker's eyes widened, and even Marsh looked stunned. Fanny's knees nearly buckled, but she stood tall, tears of relief pricking her eyes. Buttons wagged his tail, oblivious to the uproar he'd caused his job done. Grayson, unable to contain himself, shouted from the sidelines, "You're all fools. She's a smelly black woman who's addicted to drugs. She shouldn't live in America. Go back to your stinky country." The words dripping with hate silenced the room. The gallery froze and Judge Whittaker's face darkened. "Officer Grayson, you will be silent," he roared, his gavel slamming. "Your conduct is a disgrace to this court." Fanny's chest tightened, the sting of Grayson's racism cutting deep, but she felt the tide turning. The truth was undeniable now. Marcus, emboldened, pressed Heller. "Officer, you and Grayson framed Ms. Moore, didn't you? You planted the drugs to ruin her?" Heller's resolve crumbled, his shoulders sagging. "It was Grayson's idea," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "He said she was an easy target, that no one would believe her. I just went along." The confession hit like a bombshell, and the gallery erupted, voices shouting in outrage. Judge Whittaker banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the room was alive with vindication. Fanny's eyes met Buttons, and she knelt beside him, her hand stroking his fur. "You did it, boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She hadn't known Buttons was a former police dog trained under her own hand years ago, but his instincts had saved her. The courtroom, once a place of condemnation, was now a battleground where truth had triumphed. Judge Whittaker, his voice steady, addressed the room. "In light of this evidence and Officer Heller's admission, I am dismissing all charges against Ms. Fannie Moore. Officers Grayson and Heller, you are hereby detained for investigation into perjury, evidence tampering, and possession of narcotics." The gallery cheered, a wave of applause breaking out. Fanny's old friends from the sheriff's department stood clapping, their earlier silence replaced by pride. The church ladies, once distant, smiled through tears. Marcus hugged Fanny, his face beaming. "We did it, Fanny," he said, but she shook her head, pointing to Buttons. "He did it," the judge softening, allowed a rare smile. "Ms. Moore, your dog is a credit to your training. This court owes you an apology." As Grayson and Heller were led away in handcuffs, their heads bowed. Fanny felt a weight lift. The climax had arrived, and justice had prevailed, not through her words, but through the unerring nose of an old dog. Buttons, her partner in this fight, lay down contentedly, his tail still wagging. The courtroom buzzed with energy, but for Fanny it was a moment of quiet triumph. She'd faced the system's worst, and come out standing, her dignity intact, her truth vindicated. Fannie Moore's heart felt lighter than it had in months, like a bird finally freed from a cage. She stepped out of the Willow Creek courthouse into the golden glow of late afternoon, the August sun warming her face. Buttons trotted beside her, his leash loose in her hand, his scruffy tail wagging like a metronome. The town square bustled with life kids chasing each other near the fountain, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, but for Fanny, the world was quieter now. The storm of the trial behind her. At 71, she'd faced the worst the system could throw at her, and walked away acquitted thanks to her old dog's unerring nose. Officers Carl Grayson and Tom Heller were in custody, their scheme to frame her exposed. Yet Fanny knew the victory was only the beginning. The truth had opened a door, and she had to decide how to walk through it. The crowd outside the courthouse was a mix of familiar faces and strangers, some clapping as Fanny emerged, others whispering in awe. Her old friends from the sheriff's department, who'd sat silently during the trial, now approached with sheepish smiles. "Fanny, we should have known better," said Ray, a grizzled former deputy who'd worked with her dogs years ago. "That Buttons of yours, he's something else." Fanny nodded, her smile polite but guarded. The sting of their earlier doubt lingered, but she wasn't one to hold grudges. Buttons, oblivious to the praise, sniffed at a patch of grass, his graying muzzle twitching. Marcus Tate, her young public defender, walked beside her, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. "You're a free woman, Fanny," he said, his grin wide. "And Buttons, he's a hero." Fanny chuckled, patting the dog's head. "Always was, just took me a while to see it." She hadn't known Buttons was a former police dog, one she might have trained herself decades ago, but his instincts had saved her from a false conviction. The revelation still hummed in her mind, a reminder that the past could return in unexpected ways. As they crossed the square, Fanny noticed the local news van parked nearby, its camera crew scrambling to set up. A reporter, a young woman named Clara with a bright smile, hurried over, microphone in hand. "Ms. Moore, can we get a word? Your story's going viral. People are calling Buttons the old crime-solving dog." Fanny hesitated, her instinct to shy away from attention and warring with a new sense of purpose. She glanced at Buttons, who looked up with those sharp, knowing eyes and decided to speak. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady. "It's about what happens when folks get judged before they're heard." Buttons saw the truth when no one else did. The interview aired that evening on Willow Creek's Channel 7, and by morning it had spread across social media. Posts on X called Buttons a four-legged detective and Fannie a hero of justice. Strangers shared stories of their own brushes with unfair treatment, their words echoing Fannie's experience. She watched the coverage from her living room, her modest house filled with the scent of brewing coffee and the soft hum of her old radio. Buttons curled up on the rug, his snores a comforting rhythm. The attention was overwhelming, but it stirred something in Fannie, a resolve to use this moment for more than herself. Back in town, the fallout from the trial was swift. The sheriff's department announced an internal investigation into Grayson and Heller, with whispers of broader corruption surfacing. Mayor Linda Hayes, a pragmatic woman in her 50s, issued a public apology to Fannie, promising reforms. "We failed you, Ms. Moore," she said at a press conference, her voice heavy. "We're going to do better." Fannie watched the broadcast, her hands folded in her lap. She wanted to believe the words, but she'd lived long enough to know change was slow, especially in a town where old biases ran deep. Her neighbors, once distant, began to reach out. Mrs. Jenkins, the church choir leader, stopped by with a peach cobbler, her eyes teary. "I'm sorry I doubted you, Fannie," she said. "We all should have known better." Others left notes or flowers on her porch, small gestures that chipped away at her isolation. The church pews, empty during her darkest days, filled again, and Fannie found herself singing hymns with a renewed spirit. Yet she couldn't shake the memory of Grayson's hateful words, "Go back to your stinky country," or the system that had nearly crushed her. The victory was sweet, but it came with scars. Fannie spent her evenings walking Buttons through her garden, the roses and marigolds glowing in the twilight. She thought about her years training police dogs, how she'd poured her heart into serving a community that hadn't always served her back. Buttons, limping slightly from his old injury, stayed close, his loyalty a balm for her wounds. She began to see her story as a spark, one that could light the way for others. Maybe she could talk to kids at the community center, share what she'd learned about standing tall. Maybe she could train dogs again, not for the police, but for people who needed protection like she had. The opening of this new chapter wasn't without challenges. Reporters kept calling, and some townsfolk still whispered, unconvinced by her innocence. But Fannie felt a strength she hadn't known in years. She wasn't alone anymore. Buttons, Marcus, and even the strangers on X were with her. The door to her future was wide open, and she was ready to step through one steady step at a time with her old dog by her side. The scent of roses filled Fannie Moore's garden, their petals glowing in the soft light of a September evening. At 71, she sat on her porch, swing her silver hair loose around her shoulders, a quilt draped over her lap. Buttons, her 9-year-old mutt, sprawled beside her, his scruffy coat catching the breeze. His graying muzzle rested on her knee, his snores a gentle rhythm against the cricket's song. Willow Creek had settled into a quieter hum since the trial, but its echoes lingered in Fannie's heart. Acquitted of false drug charges thanks to Buttons' nose and her own resilience, she'd reclaimed her freedom. Yet the ordeal officers Carl Grayson and Tom Heller's racist plot to frame her had left marks deeper than she'd expected. As she rocked gently, Fannie reflected on the past, the present, and the road ahead. The trial's aftermath had reshaped Willow Creek. The sheriff's department, rocked by Grayson and Heller's arrests, faced a state-led investigation. Posts on X revealed whispers of other misconduct, with residents sharing stories of unfair stops and slurs. Grayson, stripped of his badge, awaited trial for evidence tampering and perjury. His hateful words, "Go back to your stinky country," replayed in news clips. Heller, cooperating with prosecutors, had taken a plea deal his career over. Mayor Linda Hayes pushed for reforms, mandating bias training and body cameras, but Fannie knew change was a slow dance. She'd seen promises made and broken before her decades in Willow Creek, teaching her to trust actions over words. Her own life had shifted in ways she hadn't imagined. The viral news story Buttons dubbed the old crime-solving dog brought letters and calls from across the country. A woman in Ohio wrote about her own false arrest, thanking Fannie for speaking out. A veteran in Texas sent a drawing of Buttons, his tail high, sniffing out justice. Fannie kept the letters in a shoebox, reading them when doubt crept in. The attention was humbling, but it also reminded her of the isolation she'd felt when neighbors turned away, their silence louder than any slur. Forgiveness came slowly, but she found it in small moments like Mrs. Jenkins's cobbler or the church choir's warm welcome. Fannie's porch became her sanctuary, a place to process the trial's scars. She'd spent 30 years training police dogs, her steady hands guiding them to protect a community that hadn't always protected her. The irony wasn't lost on her. Buttons, a dog she'd adopted by chance, had been one of her own trained years ago to sniff out drugs. She hadn't known his past, but their bond had saved her. She thought of Grayson's smirk, Heller's complicity, and the system that let them thrive. The pain of their betrayal mingled with pride in her survival. "We showed 'em, didn't we, boy?" she murmured to Buttons, who thumped his tail. The town's response was a mixed bag. Some folks like Ray from the sheriff's department had made amends, stopping by with coffee or apologies. Others, hardened by bias, whispered that Fannie had gotten lucky. She heard them at the corner store. Their eyes averted, but she held her head high. Her garden, once a refuge, became a gathering place. Kids from the community center, inspired by Button's story, begged to meet him. Fannie obliged, sharing tales of her dog training days, her voice steady as she spoke of fairness and truth. The kids listened wide-eyed, and she saw in them a chance to plant seeds of change. Her faith, tested by the trial, grew stronger. At church, she sang hymns with a new fervor, her alto blending with the choir's harmony. The pews, once empty around her, now held friends, old and new. Pastor Evans preached about justice, citing Fannie's story, and she felt a quiet pride. Yet she wrestled with questions. Why had it taken a dog to prove her innocence? Why had her service to Willow Creek counted for so little? The answers weren't clear, but she found peace in action. She began volunteering at the community center, teaching kids about dogs and resilience, her lessons laced with hard-earned wisdom. Buttons, too, basked in the aftermath. The news channel's nickname stuck, and local shops sold T-shirts with crime-solving dog printed above his scruffy face. He limped more these days, his old injury flaring, but his spirit was unbroken. Fannie spoiled him with extra treats, her laughter filling the house when he chased his tail. She saw herself in him, a survivor, underestimated but unyielding. Their walks through town drew smiles, and she let the warmth sink in, even as she guarded her heart against those who doubted her. As the swing creaked, Fannie thought of the broader echoes. Her story amplified by X, and the news had sparked conversations about race and justice. She read posts from strangers, their words, a chorus of support and shared pain. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs, too. She considered speaking at a town hall, maybe writing her story down. The idea scared her. She'd never been one for the spotlight, but Button's steady presence gave her courage. If a scruffy old dog could change the world, so could she. The stars emerged, pinpricks of light above her garden. Fannie pulled the quilt tighter, her reflection complete for now. The trial had been a crucible, forging her into someone stronger, wiser. She wasn't done fighting, not for herself or for others who'd been wronged. Buttons stirred his eyes, meeting hers, and she smiled. The echoes of their victory would carry on, a reminder that truth, no matter how small, could break through. Fannie Moore's kitchen glowed with morning light, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the scent of her rose garden drifting through the open window. At 71, she sat at her worn oak table, her silver hair catching the sun, a notebook open before her. Buttons, her scruffy hero, snoozed by her feet, his crime-solving dog fame now a badge of honor in Willow Creek. The trial where officers Carl Grayson and Tom Heller framed her for drug possession was behind her, its scars softened by her acquittal, and the truth Buttons knows uncovered. But Fannie's journey wasn't just about one woman's fight. It was a beacon for anyone who's faced injustice and dared to stand tall. Her story, amplified by news and X-posts, had sparked a fire, and she wasn't about to let it flicker out. Reflecting on her ordeal, Fannie saw herself in all of us folks who've been judged, overlooked, or silenced. Maybe you felt that sting, whether it's a whispered slur, a door closed in your face, or a system that doesn't hear you. I've known moments like that, times when the world seemed stacked against me, and I bet you have too. Fannie's victory, powered by a loyal dog and her unyielding spirit, reminds us that truth can break through no matter how heavy the odds. She didn't just win for herself, she won for every person who's been told they don't belong. Now, it's our turn to carry that torch. Fannie's thinking of sharing her story at town halls, maybe even writing a book, but she can't do it alone. We need to keep talking about justice, calling out bias, and lifting up those who've been wronged. Start in your own backyard, listen to your neighbors, question unfair rules, support local heroes like Fannie. Share her story, not just to celebrate Button's nose, but to shine a light on the work still ahead. Willow Creek is changing, but it's up to us to keep pushing to make sure no one else faces what Fannie did. So here's my challenge to you, like, share and comment on this story. Spread it on the Black Women channel on X or over coffee with friends. Subscribe to platforms that amplify voices like Fannie's and add your own story to the chorus. Every post, every conversation is a step toward a fairer world. Let's honor Fannie and Buttons by making sure their fight echoes far and wide. As Fannie sipped her coffee, she jotted down a line. Truth starts small, but it grows. That's our call, folks. Start small, but don't stop. Together we can grow a world where justice isn't just a dream, but a promise kept.